About 20 years ago now, my wife and I decided that we need more room for our family, so we picked out a house for sale that was within our budget and then went through the process of purchasing it and moving in. Now to us, the house was perfect for ourselves and our 2 kids, named Lily and Max. They loved their new bedrooms, they loved the backyard and its outdoor pool, and it was actually western facing too, so we could sit out there and enjoy the sunset every night. And the neighborhood was quiet, with friendly people who waved if they passed while I was mowing the front lawn. And it felt like our own little slice of paradise, a place where nothing bad could really happen. We were happy, and I thought that we'd found our forever home. Now weeks and weeks went by and everything stayed great. The kids played in the yard while my wife got accustomed to the new kitchen, and I was as happy as all heck with the size of the new garage. We felt very safe, like pretty much nothing could touch us. But one night, everything changed. It was late and the house was dark. The kids were asleep, Emma was in bed reading, and I was about to lock the front doors when I heard a loud noise outside. It was sort of a soft thud, like something heavy hitting the door. I kept on listening for a minute or two, and then when I didn't hear anything else, I told myself it was nothing, maybe just a car's trunk slamming in the distance. I went over to the back of the house to lock the back doors, and that's when I heard the footsteps. They were heavy, and they were only getting louder, but before I could move, the door in front of me crashes open. After being thrown back, I saw the men rush in. They were wearing black with their faces hidden behind masks. They carried flashlights and bags, and one even had some type of blunt object like a crowbar. And my legs felt weak, but I couldn't run. I had to protect my family. And the second they saw me, they rushed forward. There were 4 of them, tall, very well built. He pushed me into the living room as my wife stood at the top of the stairs, looking pale and frightened. Lily and Max woke up and ran to join her, and I wanted to tell them to run, to hide, but my voice couldn't work. It was like a dream. The men ordered my wife and kids downstairs too, and they shoved us onto the couch. They then stood over us with those flashlights that were bright, blinding us, which I guess was kind of part of their plan. Finally, one of them stepped closer. He was the tallest, and his mask was black with holes for his eyes and mouth, and he leaned down so close that I could smell his stinking breath. He didn't speak, but his eyes were burned into mine. Another man, shorter with a red mask, started pacing back and forth. He kicked over some lamp and it shattered on the floor. The sound started to make Lily cry and Emma pulled her closer. The tall one grabbed my shirt and pulled me to my feet. His flashlight was shining in my face and I squinted trying to see. The others circled us. They were like wolves circling prey. The men wanted something specific, but I didn't have much, only enough to start our new life. But that didn't seem to deter them. They carried on, searching, tearing through drawers and shelves, throwing books and dishes to the floor. One of them, with a kind of greenish mask, found a picture of us at the beach. He stared at it, and then at me. His head was tilted, like he was confused. The tall one grabbed my arm again, harder this time. He shook me, and I stumbled. Emma screamed, and Max clung to her, his face buried in her side. I wanted to fight, to push them away, but there were too many, and they were too strong. The tall one dragged me to the kitchen. He threw me against the counter, and pain shot through my ribs as I slammed into it. The others brought Emma and the kids, forcing them to sit on the floor. Lily was sobbing now, and Max's eyes were huge, like he didn't understand what was happening. I didn't either, but I had to try and stay strong for them, no matter how hard that was. The men started ripping open cabinets, pulling out pots and pans. They weren't looking for food or money. They were looking for something else, something we didn't have, but they seemed damn sure that it was there. I remember how the short one in the greenish mask suddenly stopped and pulled one of our kitchen knives from the block that held it. Emma gasped and I felt sick. The knife was long and sharp, and as he held it close to her face, my hands shook and my legs were feeling like jelly. The tall one grabbed me again, his fingers digging into my arm. He leaned close and his mask was brushing my cheek, and I could hear his breathing, very fast and heavy. They wanted something that was hidden, but they didn't say what, and I didn't know what they meant. We had no gold, no jewels, no valuable secrets hidden anywhere. That was a brand new home, our new start. All the money we had in the world was in its foundations, not in the walls or the closets. I tried to think, to remember if we found anything strange in that house, but nothing could come to mind. Just boxes and paint cans and old furniture from the last owners. I told the men that much, but they didn't believe a word of what I'd said. The one with the knife stepped closer to Emma, and my world started to go dark. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't let them hurt her or the kids. The man in the green mask stopped again. He was looking at the picture, then at us. He grabbed the tall one's arm and pointed at me. They stepped back, their heads close together. I couldn't hear them, but they were arguing in whispers before one of them suddenly said, "Shut this up! It's not here!" The tall one shook his head, but the green masked man kept pointing. He picked up another picture, one of us moving in, and stared at it. His shoulders were slumped, and he dropped the picture. The others froze, watching the two guys argue. Then suddenly they backed away. The tall one let go of me, and I fell to my knees. The man with the knife lowered it, stepping back. They looked at each other, and then at us, and then without a word, they turned and walked out no faster than they'd come in. The house was silent except for my daughter's sobs and my heavy breathing. Emma crawled over to me and we held the kids tight. My hands were shaking as I checked them for cuts and bruises, and everyone was okay. We were just terrified. I called the police. They came pretty quickly. Their lights were flashing through the windows as we went out to meet them. They searched the house and the yard and the street outside. They found footprints in the mud, but that was pretty much it. These men were gone. The police asked questions, wrote things down, and promised to look for them. But from what I told them, and I agreed with this, they said it was a mistake, that the men thought we were someone else. Maybe the last owners, maybe someone with some valuables hidden somewhere, but they didn't know who. The police never found the men, no one was arrested, and we fixed the broken lamp and cleaned up the mess. The house didn't feel like paradise anymore. Emma stopped humming all cheerfully in the kitchen, and the kids didn't really want to play outside anymore. We locked the doors, checked the windows, and slept with the lights on, and I started keeping a gun in the bedside drawer just in case. The neighborhood stayed very quiet, and nobody else was hurt, but I really couldn't shake the fear. Watching out the windows and the doors and that dark driveway out front, I wanted to protect my family, to make our home safe again in all the ways I'd failed the first time. But deep down, I knew that it would never feel the same. Paradise was gone, and all we had left were the memories and that endless fear. My name's Adam, and I'm from Leeds here in the UK, and a few years ago, myself and my parents and my sister moved into a new house not too far from our old one. It was a semi-detached place in a quiet street with a neat front gardens and old-fashioned street lamps. We had nice neighbors too, at least on one side anyway, who called over to introduce themselves with some cake and a cup of tea. But those were the neighbors in the houses surrounding us. The ones in the house attached to ours was very, very different. They didn't smile, they didn't wave, and they'd either ignore us if they saw us in the street or stare from their windows if they got the chance, with these very cold, unfriendly stares. Mom said to ignore them. Dad said that some people were just kind of like that, so rather than do anything silly to try and make them like us, we did our best to just ignore it and settle in and not let it bother us. Despite all that, the first couple of weeks were as normal as we could expect. I went to the same school, got used to playing football in the new garden, and helped Mom and Dad unpack boxes of garden furniture. Friends and family stopped over to check out the new house, and while they were mostly interested in the new place, they'd sometimes ask about the neighbors and what they were like. Mom used to say that they were quiet. Dad used to say that he'd met nicer people. And my parents never said anything overly bad about them, but people got the message. They weren't the friendliest of neighbors, and that was that. I sometimes used to wonder aloud why they were so unfriendly with us, but I never got an answer. Mom said that we should just leave them alone and hopefully they just carry on leaving us alone too. But as it turned out, just living next door to them was a liability. One night I was up in my room playing a bit of FIFA when I heard these noises outside. It sounded like car doors slamming, footsteps on the path outside, and low voices. It sounded extremely suspicious, so I got up and peeked out my window to see what was going on. In the driveway of the house next door, I saw shadows moving in the dark. I couldn't see faces, just sort of hooded shapes moving around. Then seconds later, the shapes piled into a car and sped off. I told myself it was nothing, that maybe the neighbors just had some late visitors, and then I went back to playing video games. But not before leaving my window open, something I look back on as a kind of like fate at this point. I say that because maybe only a minute or two later, I started smelling something burning, and then I heard the shouts outside. I ran to the window and saw flames all over the front door of our attached neighbor. Not just inside either, outside too, with these bright orange and yellow flames making their driveway glow as smoke climbed into the air. I grabbed my phone and called 999. Then, when Dad heard me asking for the fire brigade, he came running to see what was happening. He took one look at the flames and then shouted at us to get out of the house. All of us ran outside right away, grabbing only what was essential before standing on the pavement in our socks or bare feet. It seemed like the whole neighborhood was gathered out there by then, watching from their driveways or the street outside their homes. Apparently, the neighbors that had been targeted weren't home. We knew because their car was gone. But just the thought of them being targeted like that was still deeply shocking to us. A few minutes later, the fire engines arrived and men in heavy gear jumped out before hosing down the flames. Everyone cheered when the firemen finally put out the fire, but the neighbor's house was still a mess. The firemen checked our house too to make sure that there was no danger or risk or anything. They said the fire hadn't spread to our side, but the smell of smoke still clung to everything and made it so we couldn't just kind of carry on and try to forget. We went back inside, but I couldn't get to sleep for ages thanks to the adrenaline and that grim burn smell. The next day, some police stopped by to ask questions and take statements. I don't think they'd even finished before word got around to us. The fire wasn't some accident. It was a deliberate attack, just like we'd suspected. And that was the first time that I heard the word arson, and it wouldn't be the last. The only questions left were things like, who would do something like that and for what reason? And then we heard about the other fire. Just a few nights before ours, a house on the other side of the city had burned in an almost identical arson attack, and it didn't take long before the police started to think that the two fires were somehow connected. Everyone reckoned that it must have been some kind of retaliation, and the fact that neighbors weren't home at the time made us think they probably knew that it was coming and probably knew who did it too. It probably explained why they were so standoffish with us too. If they had those kinds of beefs going with people, it was probably just their default setting to be wary and cautious of strangers. Maybe they knew they were putting ourselves at risk just by living next door to them and didn't want to get close because they knew that it'd further put us in harm's way. And the neighborhood was quiet for a while after that. As the one who saw the fire start, I couldn't help but feel jumpy at times. Every noise made me think of footsteps or car doors. Mom and Dad tried to act normal, but I saw them watching the street too, especially when the moving truck showed up and started helping the neighbors move out. In the weeks after, nothing else happened. There were no more fires, no more strange noises, and slowly but surely the neighborhood got back to normal as kids felt safe enough to play out in the street again. The neighbor's house stayed empty for a while with a for sale sign out in the front, and it stayed like that for ages as the grass grew tall in their garden. They were gone, but their house was a reminder, a dark, broken thing next to ours that took years before the estate agents found a buyer. I've never forgotten what happened and how that night could have been much, much different should that fire have spread any quicker. Many years ago now, when our son was barely out of diapers, me and my kid's mom moved into a real nice duplex out in the suburbs. It was on a quiet street, and the neighbors were quite friendly, and some even actually came over to help us unpack. Now, the guy in the home next door didn't show up, but when we heard that he was some elderly widower who didn't get around so easily anymore, we obviously gave him an instant pass. Now, our son Luke loved the big backyard and pool that we now had. He loved his new bedroom too, but what he didn't love was the big old closet with its sliding wooden doors. He seemed almost cautious of it right away. But then a few nights after we settled in, Luke started acting very strange about his new closet. At first, he said that he wanted to keep it open, so he could see that there were no monsters in there. But then later, he said that he wanted to sleep with it closed because someone was inside the closet and they would watch him whenever we left him alone. I thought that it was just the new house making him nervous, and that his big old imagination was just getting the better of him. And so that night, to help him feel safe, I started what became a regular bedtime routine. Every night I checked his closet for monsters, I opened the doors, rustled his clothes a little, and showed him how, aside from them, it was completely empty. I'd then shut the closet, tuck him into bed, and then maybe sit in the chair and read him a bedtime story until he fell asleep. It worked for him, and he slept like the dead from then on. But for me, that feeling of unease never entirely went away. Something about Luke's fear stuck in my mind, how sort of primal and authentic it actually seemed. His mom said it was probably nothing, just a father worrying too much about his over-imaginative son. But still, I kept checking the closet every night during our little routine, which I increasingly realized wasn't for him anymore, it was for me. Now, a little time went by, maybe 2 or 3 months, and I decided to give Luke's room a deep clean. The house was old, the kind of place where dust settled just about everywhere, so I vacuumed the carpet, wiped all the windows down, and cleaned under his bed too. And then once I was done, I moved to the closet. As I swept the floor, I noticed something against the back wall. It was a little pile of sawdust, maybe an inch or two tall, piled near the back wall. Since I didn't remember seeing sawdust when we moved in, I pushed Luke's clothes aside and looked closer. And then, in that dim light, I saw it, clear as day. A small hole in the wall near the floor, about the size of a coin. There wasn't any light coming through at the time, but it was there all right. I remember my heart rate going into overdrive as these dual feelings of disgust and anger rose up inside me. The hole looked like it went straight through, so I grabbed a flashlight and shined it inside, and that's how I figured out that there was some kind of cover on the other side, something to hide it when it wasn't in use. But I knew someone could see through it if they removed the cover. The wall was shared with the neighbor's house, that elderly widower who lived on the other side of that duplex. I thought about them moving away the paper or card or whatever it was and watching my boy as he slept, and my hands shook as I thought about that. My son hadn't been imagining things. Someone really had been watching him. And so I sat back, staring at that hole. My head was pounding as 1,000 different thoughts raced around in my mind all at once. We never saw that widower much. He was mostly just sort of shadows moving behind curtains, but the thought of him watching my son made me feel sick to my stomach, but not just sick, angry too. I wanted to scream, to run next door and demand answers before taking some well-deserved retribution. But I stopped myself. I knew how it would end. If I confronted him, I wouldn't stay calm and I'd end up in jail for sure. I could feel the anger building, the kind that didn't stop. I'd hurt someone, or worse, for Luke's sake. I couldn't let that happen. I decided that I didn't want that guy to know that I knew, if that made any sense. I wanted to try and actually catch him doing something, maybe on camera, so I had actual evidence of the crime. I went to the garage, found some wood filler and a putty knife, and then worked fast to fill it in and cover it over. I then checked the wall for other holes, and when I didn't find any, I moved Luke's clothes back and swept away the sawdust. The closet looked normal again, but I didn't feel any better. What kind of person drills a hole to watch a child, and how the hell was I going to catch him in the act? My hands clenched into angry fists every time I thought about it, and I only stopped feeling murderously angry after I spoke to Luke's mom about it. And that night, I checked his closet like I always did. My son didn't know about the hole, and there was no way in hell that I was about to tell him on an account of not wanting to scare him. So I tucked him in, turned off the light, and watched him fall asleep as usual. But unlike him, I couldn't relax. Even though the hole was gone, I kept imagining the widower's eyes on the other side of the wall. I imagined him kneeling down and moving away the cover and cursing as he realized someone had gotten wise to his plan. A part of me thought that I'd have him backing off for a while, but I also knew that if he did it once, he was probably going to do it again. I started checking the closet more, during the day too. I'd slid the doors open and stare at the wall, waiting for something to happen or to hear something moving on the other side, but I never saw or heard anything. And the stress of it started to affect my sleep. I started locking the windows and back door every night, and something I never did before. I told myself it was to keep my son safe, but the truth is, I was scared too. Luke's mom felt the same way. She was furious, but she also knew that it was better not to escalate, as any sort of confrontation might go very wrong and very fast. If this guy was willing to drill a hole in the wall to spy on our kid, what else was he willing to do? I never felt the same in that house afterwards, and I never felt the same about that supposedly sweet old widower either. I wanted to catch him doing something, anything to prove what I knew. I paid to have some security cameras installed, which were super expensive compared to those Ring doorbells you can buy these days, and I thought that it'd be worth the investment, but the guy next door never did anything on any cameras. His house stayed dark, with his curtains always closed. I thought about calling the police purely just to warn them that I thought our neighbor was a creep. But not only had I removed what little evidence I had, I also wasn't sure how to phrase things to avoid sounding like some paranoid a-hole bullying his elderly neighbor. I felt like an idiot, and I still do, actually, but I kept quiet. I started sleeping with a baseball bat next to my bed, and I told myself it was just for home defense, but deep down, I knew I was ready to use it for home offense. If I heard someone in Luke's room, if I even so much as heard someone creeping around outside, I wouldn't hesitate. I even got excited about the idea of catching the guy, excited about the idea of smashing his head in, and that scared me almost as much as the hole. And after a couple of months went by and still nothing had happened, I started to relax a little. There had been no new holes, no strange noises. Luke hadn't talked about being watched in a while, and the only disturbed sleeps we got were when we'd had an unrelated nightmare. The routine definitely helped a lot in that continual process of checking the closet before tucking him in, but I never stopped checking that wall. I'd run my hand over the spot where the hole was, making sure it was still sealed, but it always was. And then one day I saw a truck outside the widower's house. No goodbye, no explanation, and the house stayed empty, and it took a while, but we actually heard that he'd passed away. And as horrible as it is to say, I actually felt relief. The hole was gone, and so was the sicko who put it in there. But the fact that it even happened in the first place, that there's people out there who'd think to do something like that, that's something I'll never be able to come to terms with. A few years ago now, my wife and I welcomed our first child into the world. We were living in a one-bedroom apartment at the time, and while that was certainly okay for a young, childless couple, we knew that we'd need more room to start a family. We started looking online and eventually found a suitable property in a pretty prominent part of our home city, but for reasons of our own personal security, that place will remain nameless for the rest of this story. The homes in this particular bit of the city were built by Celtic migrant workers almost 100 years ago now and are known as being sturdy, reliable, and affordable places to live. As you can imagine, they were incredibly popular with just about every other wannabe renter, so when me and my wife saw one of the houses there was available, we jumped at the chance to book a viewing and put a deposit down. About 6 weeks later, we were moved in, and it felt every bit the milestone that we thought it would. Our neighbors were warm and welcoming, and apart from the occasional busload of tourists, the area itself was actually nice and quiet. But then, the landlords proposed a rent hike. We were still very fresh when we got the news, so at first we had no idea how to really approach it. But then, right as we were approaching full-on panic, we got the news that a renters' union was undertaking a little investigation on our behalf, and we had to wait a few weeks to get the news, but when we did, we were over the moon. The landlords were backing down on the rent hike, and we were only going to be looking at a 3% annual raise instead of a whopping 12%. Neither me nor my wife had any inkling of what the renters' union had discovered, and we assumed they'd found some kind of bylaw that prevented the landlords from such a steep hike. But nothing could have prepared us for the truth. Nothing at all. The news about the rent hike was a stressful time for us, so I wasn't surprised when I started having these weird, recurring dreams. I just never expected them to be so vivid. The dreams would always start with me returning home from an errand, such as food shopping or a haircut, and I'd turn onto our street to find our house unlike I remembered it. All the other houses were the same regular red brick with copper-brown trim, whereas ours was just jet black all over. The roof, the brick, the doors, even the windows appeared to have been painted the deepest shade of coal dust black I'd ever seen. I'd approached the house with the neighbors watching me from their windows and open doors, but as soon as I unlocked the front door and walked inside my home, the dream would end and I'd wake up. I told my wife about the dreams and the things that I saw in them, but she agreed it was probably the stress of the move playing on my mind. Now, I tried eating better, getting more exercise, and even stopped drinking alcohol altogether, but the dreams still wouldn't go away. They just visited me less frequently. They weren't exactly a hindrance at all. I could still go about my business as usual, but seeing as I'd never had any kind of reoccurring dreams before, it was definitely something that played on my mind a fair bit and made me wonder if I should just go and see my GP about it. Now, part of the reason that I reckoned that I could carry on as normal was because I work from home. I was head of a customer service department for a major electronics chain over here in the UK, so 90% of my job involved working from my home computer to take calls and resolve tickets. And this suited me down to the ground, as not only could I put in long hours with relative comfort, but it meant that I could look after our baby daughter while my wife was at work as a nurse. She also worked very long hours, you see, and very hard too, I might add, so it meant a lot to her that I could stay home with our daughter and make sure that she was well looked after. And so one day I'm working downstairs in the living room and my daughter is watching cartoons. I made myself a cup of iced coffee and then set it down on the coffee table in the middle of the room. But then the next thing I know, my daughter kicks her legs while bursting out laughing, and she boots one of the table legs and the coffee goes spilling all over the floor. It was a full cup, one of those big plastic coffee shop cups too, so almost a full pint of iced coffee was spilling all over the hardwood floor. I rushed to get some paper towels and the anti-stain spray, not wanting to lose any money by voiding our deposit. But then when I got back, I noticed something strange about the spillage. It was sort of forming a puddle. The puddle was a rough circle, forming in the center of the floor, and every time I'd take a wipe at it, the liquid would take the shape of that same rough circle again. I quickly realized there was a very subtle dip in the floorboards, one that must have been hidden with the rug that we'd moved when we decided to redecorate the room a little. And not wanting to end up getting charged for it, we reported the discovery to the landlords immediately. They sent someone over right away, just a general handyman I think it was, and after a quick inspection of the floor, they told us that we need some serious work done to prevent the floor from rotting away completely. Using one of those tiny tube cameras, the kind that you feed into small places, the inspectors were able to determine that a series of short wooden supports had rotted away underneath the floor. These had been attached to the home's foundations, but only in one section which appeared sunken, kind of like a well. And in short, we could get a hotel around the corner for about a week, and after maybe 3 or 4 days of work and a subsequent inspection, we'd be able to return our baby daughter to a safe, clean, stable home. But unfortunately, that's not quite exactly how things went down. We did as instructed and booked ourselves into a small hotel for a week, a very bare-bones place just a couple of miles away from our new house. Then, about 3 days into our week-long stay, we got a call from one of our neighbors saying the police were outside of our house. Not just any police either. They were in a forensics van wearing those all-white coveralls. I drove over as soon as the wife got home from the gym because obviously I needed to know what was happening in our new house. But when I got there, the police turned me away at the door. They'd take my phone number and they'd be in touch once they knew what the situation was. But for the time being, we were in the dark and I had to stay away. It took a week before the landlords called us to let us know that the work was completed. When they did, I demanded a personal inspection before we moved back in, and the woman who called agreed to share everything she knew when I met her at the house. When I arrived, a brand new matching floor had been installed, and everything looked just as I remembered it. I obviously didn't test the new floor by pouring a drink over it, but I was assured that the foundations had been renovated and that the issue was now resolved. It was then that I asked what caused the police to come round, because if it was serious enough to involve the law, it was serious enough that we needed to know about it too. And that's when the woman sat me down over a cup of tea and laid it all out for me. First thing, they were offering a rent freeze for 3 years if we promised not to talk about this until after we'd moved out. And since we've been moved out of that house for a number of years now, I'm obviously free to talk about it now. The second thing was that the woman had sworn statements from not one, but 2 council-approved structural engineers, both of whom were happy to attest to our home's safety and security. So if we did choose to move back in, we could sleep soundly knowing that there were no structural issues. Those were all well and good, but what I wanted more than anything to know was to find out what was under our floor. And then after signing my half of a 36-month rental agreement, she spilled the beans quite spectacularly. Almost 100 years ago, when the streets and the houses were still brand new, a family had welcomed a child into the world. But this child was not one they had expected. I can't remember exactly what the poor child's condition was. I'm not even sure the authorities had it entirely sussed out either. But it was clear that whatever it was as debilitating as it was severe. She couldn't walk like other children, she couldn't talk like other children, and by every estimation, she didn't act like other children either. Then, as a result, she never made it into double-digit ages. It's also clear that whatever happened to the poor girl, her parents couldn't find it in themselves to take her to the local cemetery. Maybe it was just too expensive to hire an undertaker or whatever, and maybe they had a hand in her death. Either way, they evidently decided the best place for their dearly departed daughter was under the house they built with their own hands. Since there was no one left alive to question and no one left alive to charge, the police simply moved the girl's remains someplace that they could properly dispose of her. After that, they closed their investigation and allowed the renovations to recommence. Then, after a week or so later, there I was, sitting in that exact same space, talking myself back into moving back in. There was just enough time for us to back out if we really wanted to. My wife still had to sign her part of the form as the second adult occupant, but even once I'd explained the whole situation to her, she thought the same thing I did. It was too late to start the whole process of moving again. Doing it one time had been exhausting, so facing it all over again was just kind of unthinkable. Even if that did mean staying in a house where the 100-year-old corpse of a severely disabled girl had been recently found. Once my wife had signed her half of the paperwork, we moved back in the next day, and over the next couple of weeks, I stopped having those weird dreams where I'd find our house had turned that sort of inky shade of black. The scariest part of the recurring dream was this. I'm a grounded scientific guy, but I don't have a hard time explaining the dream. Before the renovations, when there was an illegal burial site under our house, who knows what kind of mold or spores or decay could have been drifting up from that sepulcher underneath our feet, affecting my mental state or that of my loved ones. I had dreams, similar dreams, but they were never quite the same. I'd turn onto our street after running whatever errand I'd been on, only to find our house looking the exact same as all the others. No one would be watching from their windows, no one would be peeking out from around their doors. I'd just walk inside as per usual and then wake up feeling refreshed and clear-headed. And things carried on like that for years, as if nothing had ever happened. And then one day, me and my wife decided that we wanted a little more room, and we moved into a 3-bedroom house a couple of miles away from the first. My daughter still doesn't know what they found or why we had to move out of that new house for a week, and I'm not sure she remembers any of it to begin with. Maybe I'll tell her one day, or maybe I'll show her the video you end up putting this story in if you do end up using this. Hopefully it'll make it an easier thing to handle, but I think the word hopefully is doing a lot of heavy lifting there. My name is Terry, and this is a story from back when me and my family moved into our first real home together. So back in 1994, my wife and I and our 2 kids moved into a big house down in a quiet Texas town. The house was very old but very beautiful, with huge bay windows and a massive backyard. And the yard was maybe half the size of a football field, and it was filled with thick grass and old trees. But while my wife, Angie, and I told ourselves we'd explore every inch of it before we moved in, we had much more pressing issues at hand. And so the whole thing got put on the back burner until much later on. We loved the open space, and as long as we did the occasional snake check to make sure that there were no rattlers around, the backyard seemed like the perfect place for our 2 kids to play. And that house felt like a fresh start, a place to make memories, and for the first few weeks, nothing could have been better. But then, my 2 kids found something that changed everything for us. Sarah Jane was 10 and Jack was 8, so they were just as excited about that backyard as we were. Once we made sure that there were no unexpected hazards and we'd given most of the lawn a little trim, the kids were free to chase each other around all over the place. But then one afternoon, they came running inside looking very excited. Then, when their mom asked them what was going on, they explained how they thought that they had actually found buried treasure in the backyard. I followed them outside, curious and not worried at all, and they led me to a spot near the back of the yard where we'd had a gardener trim back the bushes. And there, half buried in the ground, was a heavy metal door. It looked old and rusted at the edges, with a thick lock holding it firmly shut. And I hadn't noticed it before. Angie and I must have missed it, and the landscaper must have thought that we knew about it already. Now the kids begged to open it, but I told them to stay back. Jack said that it was buried treasure, left there by a pirate, and I told him whatever it was probably not any kind of treasure. Pirates keep their treasure in bank accounts these days, not underground in chests. And the door looked heavy, but after clipping off the lock with a pair of bolt cutters, I managed to pull it open, which revealed a dark staircase which led down under the ground. And the air smelled damp, cold, and rotten, no place for any kid to be. So, after making them promise not to go down without my permission, I grabbed a flashlight from the house and shone it down into that hole. And the steps were concrete, and while they looked pretty worn, they appeared very sturdy for their age. I told the kids to wait where they were, and I assured them that I'd share anything I'd found, and then went down alone. Now, just seconds later, my flashlight was lighting up a small room at the bottom. But it wasn't just a room. It looked more like a bunker. It was small, just a single room with concrete walls and a low ceiling. A metal cot sat in one corner with a thin, stained mattress lying on it. And then there was a rusty sink bolted on the wall and a toilet attached to the same wall close by. The fixtures looked very old, just like everything else, but when I walked up to the sink and turned one of the faucet knobs, water came out. Water that was both clear and cold. I figured the place had been abandoned long ago, that maybe it was some Cold War relic that had thankfully never had to serve its purpose. But I was wrong. Someone must have been living down there, and pretty recently too. A single light bulb hung from the ceiling, flickering when I pulled its chain, and that's when I saw the scratches on the walls. Deep and uneven, like someone had clawed at them with nothing but their fingernails. Suddenly freaked out by what I'd seen, I climbed back out and closed the door behind me. The kids were waiting, very wide-eyed and excited to hear what I had to say. And so you can imagine their disappointment when I told them that the bunker was entirely off limits. And they tried to argue with me at first, and I had to scare them a little to make sure that they listened by claiming that there might be monsters or even mean wild animals living down there. And that didn't feel great, having to spook my own kids, but as any parent will tell you, you sometimes gotta lay down the law if you want to keep your kids actually safe. And that night, my wife and I talked about what I'd found, and we agreed that not only should we stop the kids from ever seeing what was down in that bunker, but that we better call the cops to let them know what we'd found. The bunker was very unsettling to me. You see, to me, it wasn't just some normal place for storms or maybe even bombs. It might have been built for that, and it might have also served that purpose at one time. But when I saw it, it was almost like a makeshift prison cell. The scratches, the cot, the working plumbing, I felt like they told a story that I didn't want to know. It felt like a secret that we didn't want to be a part of, and we didn't want that secret in our new home. 2 sheriff's deputies stopped by the next day after we called. They followed me to that bunker, and I showed them the metal door in the room below. One of them wrote down some notes while the other asked a bunch of questions, and they checked the sink and the toilet, noting that the water was still working, and agreed that that was probably not a great sign. They also found a small chain bolted to the floor near the cot, something that I hadn't seen during my first visit down there. It looked kind of rusted, but it was still very strong, and my skin wanted to crawl off my bones when I saw that. Stating the obvious, one of the deputies said the bunker was likely used to hold someone, and probably against their will. They didn't say much else, but their faces were obviously very pale as they said this, and they told us that we weren't in any trouble, that we'd done the right thing in reaching out to them. But for the time being, we were to keep that bunker locked. They would investigate and let us know if they did find anything. And that same day, I drove over to the Home Depot in town, bought a brand new padlock, and relocked the door to that bunker. I told our kids obviously to stay away from it. They nodded, but I saw this very deep curiosity in Jack's eyes, like it was another conspiracy to keep him away from the treasure that we'd found down there. And it made me glad that I bought that padlock. It was the only thing stopping him from going down there and seeing all the stuff for himself. And at that age, seeing dark stuff like that can have a terrible effect on a child's mind. The house felt different because the yard didn't feel safe anymore, and I tried to forget it and move on, but every time I was out there in the yard, my mind went to that bunker and all those scratches on the wall. Who had been kept down there? For how long? And most importantly, why? The cops called us back a few days later, but they didn't have the answers we needed. They said they found no records of the bunker anywhere in any files or documents related to the property, and the home's previous owners also claimed no knowledge of it. They were all the way up in Oklahoma and had never visited the property. And then the folks who likely had it built were dead, and there were basically no one to talk to or question that had any solid answers for them. And as a result, the sheriff's department couldn't say who built it or when. And they also found no evidence of a crime, so even if there were folks around to arrest, there was really nothing to charge them with. They told us to keep it locked for safety reasons, and that naturally, we had the right to concrete it over if we wanted to, maybe to grow a lawn over it, anything we wanted. And I remember thanking them for the time, but also thinking that it was all just kind of pointless. That bunker stayed sealed, like a very dark secret that we kept buried in our backyard. I checked the padlock every week, making sure that it was staying, and I didn't want anyone or anything getting in there, least of all one of our kids. And years had passed by, and the kids started to grow up, and the bunker stayed off limits, but I knew that they probably still thought about it, especially our son. Sometimes I saw him glance at the bushes that we grew in the backyard, right over where the door was hidden. He didn't talk about it often, but it was always there, almost like a black mark that we couldn't ever wash clean. Angie and I tried to make life as normal as possible for Jack and Sarah Jane. We had backyard barbecues, played some football, and succeeded in filling in the house with joy and laughter and some happy memories. But that bunker was always in the back of our minds, and how could it not be when it was just right under our feet? And as the years passed, Sarah Jane and Jack moved out. Sarah Jane went to college, while Jack got a job in another city, and the house felt empty without them. But I was glad that they were finally away from that thing. Angie and I stayed there, but the house felt a bit too big now, and anytime I was out in the backyard, I just avoided that corner where the bushes hid the door. One night, I woke up at maybe 1 a.m. to take a bathroom trip. I figured that I'd heard it when washing my hands, but when I turned off the faucet, I heard it. The slow scraping sound, like metal on stone, and it was coming from the backyard. I quickly made my way downstairs, grabbed my pistol with the little flashlight attachment that I had bought specifically for home defense, and then went out in the backyard. It was cold and almost pitch black out there, but after walking across the lawn, I pushed through the bushes near the back and checked the lock on the bunker door. The padlock was still there, but the dirt around the door looked disturbed, like someone had been digging. I told myself it was probably just an animal, maybe a raccoon, but I couldn't convince myself, and a part of me thought that maybe it was Jack, but that seemed insane. Another part of me thought that it was whoever had owned the house before, maybe even the person who had been kept down there. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and there are super fun live streams every Sunday and Wednesday night. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over at my email, letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com, and you might even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. I also have a true crime channel called Saturn Soul. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, your gray matter is turning blue.